Everything went fine for about 500 feet. But then the biggest red bird I ever saw mistook that hook for a descending spider, swooped in, swallowed it whole, and landed in a rhododendron bush up on the shore. Well, I thought about my mother and her bird feeders and how much she loves birds. And I tried to gently coax that bird out of that rhododendron bush. But when that didn't work, I started thinking about my state income tax return and how every year I'd check that box to donate $1 to the non-game wildlife fund. And I said to myself, Bill, you bought that bird. You're going to have to do what you have to do, and I hauled back on the monster stick just as hard as I could, and that rhododendron bush verily erupted in a mushroom cloud of crimson feathers and red petals, and that entire blob was headed on a perfect trajectory straight for my tire when lightning struck twice. You see, a 4-foot brook trout mistook that blob for his Fly of the Month subscription, came out of the water, paid cash on delivery, swallowed that whole thing, dove back in the water, swam upstream right through the hole in the middle of my tire, hit his head on a rock, did a couple of somersaults, and landed up on shore. Well, I just stood there watching to see what was going to happen next, and sure enough, before long there was a rustling in the underbrush, and a big old black bear stepped out. He sniffed that fish a couple of times, and then he swallowed it whole. Well, I started to feel good again then, 'cause I knew there was nothing in the air, nothing in the water, and nothing in the woods that was going to come and eat that bear. So I just started reeling. I reeled that bear off the shore and into the water, and then I reeled him downstream until his head went right through the hole in my tire, and then I just started reeling up. Well, after a while, I heard a voice behind me. Now, this was no ordinary voice. This was the sort of voice that wakes you up at 4 in the morning and says if you don't raise $2 million by Sunday, you're getting called home. And he said to me, Son, what are you doing? I said, oh, I'm trying to get my tire back. And he said, well, it looks to me like you're fishing. And I think it's safe to say that fellow was a mite surprised when he took a step over to the edge of that bridge, looked down, and saw what I was bringing up. But I have to admit that I was a mite surprised, too, because as it turns out, he was a state game warden. Well, I didn't know what else to do except to keep on reeling, so I got that whole blob up to the edge of the bridge and just kind of lifted it up over the lip there. That bear just lay there. All the fight had gone out of him about 700 feet. But that officer, he looked at that and he said, Son, I don't know why you did this. He said, I don't want to know why you did this, but I can tell you that you are in a heap of trouble. And he reached in his back pocket and pulled out his little cop notepad. He reached in his front pocket and pulled out his little cop pencil, and he commenced a-writing. And he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, pausing only long enough to ask me my name, date of birth, social security number, that sort of thing. Every now and again, he'd flip a page. When he was finally done writing, he said to me, he said, Son, you see that bear right there? I said, yes, sir. He said, that's a black bear. That's the state animal of the great state of West Virginia, which you've taken illegally out of season without a permit. That's a $500 fine. He said, you see that fish sticking out of that bear's mouth? I said, yes, sir. He said, that's a brook trout. That's the state fish of the great state of West Virginia, which you've taken from a no-fishing zone. That's a $200 fine. He said, you see that bird sticking out of that fish's mouth? I said, yes, sir. He said, that's a cardinal. That's the state bird of the great state of West Virginia. That's a non-game bird which you have taken from a federally protected bird sanctuary. That's a $100 fine. He said, you see those flowers sticking out of that bird's beak? I said, yes, sir. He said, those are rhododendron flowers, son. Rhododendron is the state flower of the great state of West Virginia, which you've taken from a no-flower picking zone. That's a $50 fine. He said, you see that tire around that bear's neck? I said, yes, sir. He said that tire constitutes litter. Litter which you've caused to be thrown into a national scenic waterway. That's a $200 fine. He said those fines in aggregate shall total $950 payable in cash on the spot right now, or you can opt for legal confinement until such payment is made. Well, he looked at me in my old blue jeans and my worn-out combat boots and the great golden carp cruiser kind of teetering on 3 wheels there, and he said, you look like the kind that's going to opt for legal confinement. Well, he was already looking at me like I was crazy, so when I reached in my pocket, he went for his gun. but I just pulled out that wad of crisp new 980 $1 bills, and I counted out 950 of them for him. Well, he was so pleased with that he introduced me to his brother-in-law, who fixed my flat tire for the amazing low price of $28. And as I was heading home, I was thinking to myself that if every fishing trip was going to be that expensive, I wasn't going to be able to go all that often. But then I started thinking about my wife, and, well, I've told you people this story, and I'm sure you believe every word of it. But my wife, well, she's the suspicious type, and if I'd gone in with this tale, she wouldn't have had none of it. So even though it's against my grain, I decided I was going to have to lie to her. And as I walked in the door, she said, "How'd it go?" I said it went just fine. And as I was leaving the room, I reached in my pocket, pulled out those last 2 crisp $1 bills, and I said, "Oh yeah, I almost forgot. I won this for you in the lottery today." The 7th second. My friends and I attended and studied at West Virginia Wesleyan College in Buchanan, West Virginia. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, mostly we just attended West Virginia Wesleyan College. At any rate, not far from our school, there was a railroad tunnel that a man could climb up into, lay down on the rafters, and stare down at the tracks below, watch the trains as they came through the tunnel. Now, I say a man could climb up into this tunnel, 'cause no woman would ever be stupid enough to. Anyway, this would have been April, about 10 years ago. It was going on noon, and Paul, Stephen, and myself had just rolled out of our respective beds, and seeing how we all had class at 12:30, we figured it was a perfect time to take a hike. So there we were, laying belly down 30 feet above Weirton's world-famous steel, fashioning the CS&X railroad tracks running clear from Cowan to Grafton via Burnsville, Buchanan, Carrollton, and Philippi. Now, we'd done this sort of thing before, so when we heard a train whistle in the distance, we didn't think twice about it. But then, to our horror, we heard a sonic boom, and looked down just in time to see General Chuck Yeager at the controls of the lead engine of that CS&X monster train, now passing at Mach 1 beneath us. Now, when that train hit that tunnel going Mach 1, that tunnel became a vacuum old Mr. Hoover could only dream of. Everything within 6 miles of that tunnel was getting sucked in one end and blown out the other. I'm talking about sticks, rocks, trees, houses, outhouses, herds of cattle, you name it. Fact is, I ain't seen so much crap blown so fast since the last presidential campaign. I just looked down and said, "Eureka." But then you have to understand that the rafter I was laying on gave way under the stress, and the next thing I knew, I was stuck to the back of that train like a fly to paper. But that ain't the half of it, 'cause the minute that train left the tunnel, the vacuum quit, and I started sliding down towards the tracks below. Well, I managed to flip around and grab hold of the rear axle of that train. I was kind of flapping out there like the tail on a kite. But the lift was leaving me quick, and I knew my feet would soon be dragging. It was a classic between a rock and a hard place situation, and I figured there were 2 things I could do. I could either reach in my pocket, pull out my whip, lash it to those engines, and pull myself up like old cousin Indiana Jones, or I could somehow clamber up into that coal car and burrow a hole in our bituminous pal coal. Well, I didn't think pulling out my whip was a very good idea, so I reached in my pocket, pulled out my stainless steel 74 function Swiss Army type knife, and I quickly opened up the harpoon gun and the grappling hook. I lashed a one-handed bowline around myself, 2 half hitches around that grappling hook, and then I fired it up into the coal car. Now, my arms were tired from holding myself out like old cousin Superman, so it took me 3 or 4 seconds to finally clamber up into that coal car and get down in that hole. Well, I took a deep breath and I said, "Phew." And then for the first time in the whole trip, I opened my eyes. Lord have mercy. The tracks behind me just turned bright red and melted away. The creosote timbers burst into flames. The trees alongside the track pulled themselves out of the ground, and the mighty Buchanan River was swelled up into a 40-foot tidal wave. Rate we were moving, I guess I was pretty lucky I hadn't lost my hat.